and thanks for tuning in. How many of you believe that the SAT is an objective measure of intelligence? Do you see IQ tests and the SAT as similar? What if I told you that the College Board, the maker of the SAT, can no longer use the A in SAT to stand for aptitude? So if that's the case, what does the SAT actually measure? Moreover, is it possible that colleges have answered that question for themselves when deciding to go test optional? In this episode, I chased those answers with Ned Johnson. He is the founder and owner of PrepMatters. Through his company, he has logged nearly 50,000 hours of tutoring with kids preparing for standardized tests. He is also the author of several books, including Conquering the SAT and The Self-Driven Child, The Science and Sense of Giving Your Kids More Control Over Their Lives. Join us as we jump right into it, with Ned providing insight from 30 years of helping kids conquer not only the SAT, but their fears and anxiety about academic goals in general.
The way that I look at standardized tests is they provide some value, but there's a real question whether the side effects are worse than the purported uses of it.
Right.
There's a missed opportunity in the book. I mean, in the movie, in that a lot of when we look at underperformance, from my perspective, it is rooted in neuroscience and the effects that stress has on performance.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the same way that there are many kids who perform really well in school and underperform on tests, we're trying to understand what is going on there.
Yeah.
There are also children who don't perform very well in school, but really perform well on standardized tests. And and among other things, there's a gene called the COMT gene. I can't commit it to memory.
Okay.
Catechol, whatever, that regulates how quickly the prefrontal cortex metabolizes dopamine. So dopamine, the neurotransmitter, the kind of focus, get up and go kind of thing. And so there are two different alleles. One is a fast acting and one is a slow acting. Mm-hmm. And so the research on this, they describe in this New York Times article I can share with you, they describe people who have the slow acting variants as worriers, meaning they only need a little bit of oomph to go, oh my gosh, that thing that's due 3 months from now, I'm going to start on it this weekend, right? Where warriors who have fast acting go, 3 months, let's go play video games, right? Let's go do this or whatever, right? And so then what happens under pressure is the prefrontal cortex floods with more dopamine. And so if you're one of these worriers, the IQ advantage that you have kind of disappears because your brain stops working, right? Or it stops working as efficiently. It's like an engine that's flooded, car engine that's flooded, where the warriors who they just couldn't get themselves on a day in, day out basis to do the work because they're like, whatever, can walk in and crush the test. Like I was talking with a guy, he's actually a carpenter. He said, that was me. He said, I would get basically kind of Fs on everything. And then the final exam, I'd get an A. Right. And there are also students who get A's on everything and then bomb on the final exam.
Right.
And so in this, they kept profiling this girl who's like, there must be something wrong with the test. There must be something wrong with the test. I get straight A's, and I only don't even say what the score is. And my SAT score wasn't nearly as good. Well, that isn't necessarily so, because there's the question of which brain is your brain, right? So Arnold's brain when it's totally chill and there's no urgency, or Arnold's brain when there's a lot of pressure.
Right.
And it's different for different folks, right? And so, the kind of end of the day, you want to have both worriers, I don't love the term, and warriors, right? If you'll indulge me, this.
Yeah, no.
We have this, my wife and I have this, we have this family cabin out in upstate New York. And I bought this 1971 John Deere tractor.
Okay.
And it's because it's a big knowing deck and it was inexpensive and it's 1971. So I'm, of course, a typical boy, right? And so I'm using these things in ways that they're probably not supposed to. And I get the thing sort of stuck in this little ditch. I'm like, darn it, right? I'm like, and it's not really that deep, but the wheels are spinning, like, goodness gracious. And what I really need to do is go down and get my wife's SUV and haul the thing out. But I don't want to do that. If only Arnold were there and just give me a little push, because it's not really deep, we're just a little bit stuck, right? But I don't have an Arnold, so what can I do? And then it occurs to me, because it's a 1971 John Deere tractor. Today, if you get off the tractor, the thing shuts off because it's a safety thing. But 1971, nobody cared, right? So I get off and the thing's engaged. I've turned off the mowing deck, mind you, and I'm pushing and pushing and pushing to get this thing go. And of course, I slip. And of course, my arm comes underneath, you know, the footbed, right, and down along the drivetrain. And of course, I slice open my arm in a dramatic way. And so I'm like, oh, shoot. So now I'm bloody and I still am gonna have to get the car. So I turn off the engine, right? I'm compressing, right? Like, oh gosh. And I have no idea how bad it is. I just know there's a lot of blood.
Right.
So I'm walking down the house. I'm like, oh, you know, okay, don't pass that here. Don't pass that here. Don't pass that here. Don't pass that here.
Right.
Because we're quite away from the house. I get close to where my wife is and I bellow to her and she's like, what? And I'm like, please come here. And she comes over and she just sees all this blood and her face goes and she just goes white. It just,
right.
And I said, please get the children, the little guys, get the car keys. I think we need to go to the hospital.
Yeah.
Frozen.
Oh,
frozen.
Wow.
I say it again, frozen.
Yeah.
She looks at me and says, what do I do? And I'm like, this is hilarious. I'm like, please, I don't want to drive. And I kind of yell at her a little bit to sort of break it. You know, get the car keys, right? And I'm laughing because in that crisis, and it's not a character thing, it's just neurochemistry, right? I'm the guy sliced up and bleeding, sort of giving instructions. So under a crisis, the way that my brain works, my brain just works better under pressure than hers does under extreme pressure. But, and this is the important thing, those crises that I sort of blithely created, she would avoid 99% of them because she anticipates, I don't think that's a very good idea. Maybe we should do it this way. Where I'm like, what's the worst that could happen? Right. She never finds out. Right. I always find out, right? Right. You're like, okay.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. What you're pointing to is this growing sense that what we have been calling what we have been calling intelligence,
right,
as like solely a mental process, is more of it's more of a physical / chemical process that, like, as cognitive science continues to evolve and improve, that we're able to better detect. So does that sound?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you know, the way that I think about it, a lot of people would argue that cognition, you know, intelligence, it's like a light switch. You got it or you don't. You know, if you could do this, you would have done it, but you didn't. So clearly you don't. Right. And particularly with things like quote unquote standardized tests, or we think of these as, you know, again, objective measurements, air quotes, objective measures. And the problem, and I'm not a neuroscientist, but I read a lot of this stuff and I'm just fascinated by it. And it's certainly been my experience helping kids through these tests. My experience is the test by definition cannot be objective when you and I can have such wildly different subjective experiences of taking that test, right? I mean, it's like you go into a movie, right? And, you know, you can think it's hilarious and I think it's traumatic based on experience that I had before, right? What's funny for me is not the same thing, because people bring not only different life experience, but literally different neurochemistry to the thing, right? There's a wonderful book called The End of Average by Todd Rose. He's a professor of psychology at Harvard. And it just goes on and on about this. But the opening salvo in the book is about pilots in the Second World War who kept crashing too many planes. And they're like, this is a problem. And they kept training and sort of yelling at these guys, good Lord, you people, like, these are expensive. Right? And they brought in some kind of, you know, 20-something, you know, Wonderkid who was sort of physiologist or an anatomist or whatever the word is. And he was looking at this. And so he basically just started studying the physiques of these pilots. Okay. And like 41 different measures. So, you know, how tall are you? How broad are your shoulders? You know, how long your legs, all these kind of things. Right. And then looked at cockpit design. And it turned out, even when they instead had 41 things, that they went down to like 4 different measures. Like out of, I don't know, 4,000 pilots, there were like 25 of them, I'm making up the numbers, of course, who were average. Basically, nobody was average. And so when they changed the cockpits, you can move the seat up and down, you can move the thing up a little down. Like, you know, the way, you know, your car and I go and sit in this, I'm either going to be like, man, he is tall and I'm not, or I'm like jammed up against it. It just doesn't fit us equally. And so that exists in tested also from my perspective exists in schools.
Interesting.
So, a hard thing to be a teacher, because you can be sitting there teaching the class and there are a third of people who are right with you and say, boy, Mr. Key is just terrific. It's an awesome, right? And there are a third of people who are like, I'm slowly dying. Why is he going so
Yeah,
slowly?
right.
This is, oh my God. And they're checking out their phones and they're not paying attention because they figured this out, 10 minutes ago. And
Mm-hmm.
there's another third, and not even thirds necessarily, who are like, oh, he's going so fast, I don't understand, right? And their brains are flooded with neurotransmitter, with cortisol, right, in the body. And now they feel stressed the whole time. And they're not learning from you as much as they could, because they feel like, the two guys in the bear, they feel like the slower guy who's about to get eaten by
Right.
the bear, right? So to answer, your question, yeah, I mean, when we think about kind of intelligence, it's a lot more complex than people expect. Actually, do you know the work of Howard Gardner in Frames
Yes.
of Mind?
Yes.
That kind. What's the joke about it? Was that Einstein? If you want to, teach a fish to ride a bicycle or whatever the heck, the ability of a fish to climb a tree.
Yeah.
It is intelligence. What we think of as intelligence is way too narrow.
Right. Right.
And we're probably not. And you and I may be imagining very different things. We're using the same word, but we have
Right.
different things. It's
Yeah. So to prepare for today, I went back to your first book, Conquering the SAT, or the book that you wrote there. Yeah, I still have it. I still have it. So
great.
in looking through that, you're already tapping on some of the things that I wanted to ask you about, from the book.
Mm-hmm.
Now, clearly, since 2007, when it was published,
Mm-hmm.
you've had more time to reflect and to think about, things that you brought up there. But you asked some really interesting questions there, or posed some really interesting questions from that, which, I wanted to speak to a bit now. So one of them, you already spoke to it. It's this idea that the test is not specifically measuring intelligence. I mean, we think it is, and it is measuring a form of cognition, but it's not necessarily an objective form of cognition or an objective form of intelligence. The way that you describe it in the book, in talking about the way the questions are written, right?
Yes.
What you're saying is
that
ETS is asking a question about common knowledge in a way that makes it difficult for the test taker to know exactly where they're coming from.
Right.
So you could actually possess the knowledge required to answer the question, but you have to get through and you have to be able to interpret the question in the way that the test maker is asking it in order to answer the question properly. Does that sound accurate based upon what you?
Yeah, I mean, yes. I mean, the way that when I think about students bring to these tests, skills and knowledge, right? The challenge, there's several things there. One, what we think of as a common base of knowledge. Well, who necessarily gets to decide what really should be on there? The SAT, when it changed itself in 2016, was trying to, actually 5 and then 16, was trying to align more with the Common Core, the standards of the Common Core. So that was a whole lot better than the old versions of the SAT. The old SAT used to claim to be an aptitude test, and then test all of this wildly esoteric vocabulary, like, I don't know, esoteric. And if you knew that, great, then clearly you're smart as opposed to knowledgeable. I mean, it was foolish on its face. But also, folks can, have, to your point, Arnold, can have the knowledge and can have the skills, but if it's presented in a way that's a little bit curveball-y, right? They don't quite see it the right way. And so when I work with kids, I kind of talk about, we're going to lean on the academic skills and the knowledge you already got. Awesome. And it's my job to help you understand a little bit more kind of the mindset of the test makers, right? How do they do things? And I mean, the SAT, in my view, has always been part of the charm of it that I enjoy, right? Because it's entertaining to me. But part of what's really, really not so kind to kids who are taking this test and feel like the test really matters is that it can be kind of tricky. Now, they would dispute that. They would use different language. It's using what tool to, knowing what tool to use and when. But yeah, goodness knows, there are many questions on there that are designed to be hard because of being tricky rather than hard because of testing advanced content.
Right.
And I suppose I don't know. It's, in some ways, I guess you have to, because if you have a standardized test that's based on math that goes up through calculus,
Mm-hmm.
and you've done calculus and I haven't, well, is that testing my ability with that information, or is it a testing acquired knowledge?
Right.
I would say that the most honest standardized test is one that is testing command of knowledge, but we need to be really clear on what that common body of knowledge is.
Okay.
And for goodness sakes, I really think, the SAT long ago gave up the idea, the moniker of the Scholastic Aptitude Test, because to treat it like it's a test pure and simple of IQ is,
Right.
one, provably wrong, and two, really upsetting to folks who underperform on tests.
Right.
And it's threatening.
Right.
It's threatening.
Yeah. And this interesting too, because, recognizing how pivotal standardized
Mhm.
tests are in claims of bias,
Mhm.
affirmative action
Mhm.
cases.
Mhm.
There's the implication that the test is supposed to be measuring that, and right. And so
Yeah.
it's supposed to be measuring the worthiness of students to attend particularly
Right.
highly selective schools.
Right.
So
Right.
given the fact that the SAT cannot even say anymore that the A stands for aptitude, but that they
Right.
just have to call it SAT,
Right. Yeah.
it says something about the ways in which we as as parents or as people in policy
Right.
areas interpret what the
Right.
SAT is actually doing. So, but that said, something else I wanted to ask you about
Mhm.
has to do with the way that you talked about math in that book, where
Mhm.
uh,
Can I come back on that for 1 second? I want
oh
to,
yeah,
because
yeah,
you talk about, kind of how it's used. Are you familiar with the work of Claude Steele and
I am.
Stereotype Threat?
Oh, yeah,
Okay, yeah,
absolutely,
yeah,
yes, I
yeah.
wrote about that.
That's what I assume you're sort of getting at, or hinting at a little bit.
Yes,
And so for folks who don't know this, Stereotype Threat is the idea that if I'm a member of a group about whom there's a plausible, doesn't have to be true,
right,
but plausible negative stereotype,
right,
then being reminded of my in-groupness before
yes,
doing the task
right,
about that is threatening, it
mhm,
affects performance. So Professor Steele, when he'd been at, so it's a wonderful one. I'll come back. So when he
yeah,
was a professor at Michigan, he was
mhm,
looking at what looked to him like underperformance among and this is, I think, in the 80s, African American students compared to white students. Like, what's going on? Because these are academic folks, they came in the same way, like kind of what.
mhm,
And he gave them, he designed this test with I guess the psychology department there, where they gave white and black students a test. And what they do to sort of create or either to induce stress or lower stress is they prime them. So you ask an activity or questions beforehand. So when they basically set up the test with, hey, folks, we're gonna take an hour of your class time. We're just trying to get some data for the folks down the hall that they want it. So just just do your best on this and try to take it seriously. I'd be personally grateful. No statistical difference between white and black students, and it was a math section of a GRE, if I remember correctly.
mhm,
Usually, math is where when people get stressed, and we can come back because you're asking about math.
yeah,
Working memory, the ability to hold information in your head, see things from different angles, that is by being stressed. No discernible difference. When they did the same thing again, but asked all these questions, they were very stereotypical, very loaded, with not so generous stereotypes about black people. The scores just fell through the floor.
right,
So he went on, along with a guy named Josh Aaron, to study this in just every corner of the world you can imagine. With they took white and black athletes and said, this is a test of natural athletic ability. The
mhm,
white guys cratered, right?
mhm,
If they
mhm,
said this is a test of athletic intelligence, the black guys cratered. And you're like, and again, there's
right, I know,
it's the same damn activity, right? It's
right,
like, my favorite one in this was they did work out at Stanford, because he was at Stanford for a while. And they took white athletes, and I think they were on the men's basketball team, but I'm not sure. and they had them do 3 activities: standing broad jump, vertical jump, and number of push-ups in a minute. Have the guys, okay, write it all down, chill out for 15 minutes, we'll do this again. Scores
Right.
go up, they're a little looser second time. Repeat the thing. So I'm okay, guys, that'll be great. I walk out, I'll be back in about 15 minutes. But instead of me, you walk back in. So instead of a geeky white guy, it's a geeky black guy, just giving you a hard time, right? Now the scores don't go up, they stay flat.
Right.
They do it a third time. I'll be back, and they replace me, not with you, someone even more physically imposing than you. Like, I don't know, LeBron James walks in or something, right?
Right.
Now the scores don't go up, they don't stay flat, they fall.
Mhm.
But only for one of those 3 activities.
Right.
Standing broad jump, vertical jump, number of push-ups in a minute. And of course, it's the vertical jump, because there's no stereotype that I, as a nerdy white guy, can't do push-ups. There's a stereotype that I can't jump. And the fun part was, they weren't testing, can I jump as high as LeBron James? Nobody needs to test it. We pretty much know how that one's going to work out, right? They're testing, can I jump as high as I can jump? Because I just did it 15 minutes ago.
Right.
And now under threat, and again, it's perceived threat. It doesn't have to be true.
Right.
I can't do what I can do. And so when it's something that fundamental with a physical activity, imagine something as complex as a human brain and all the emotions that are tied up in there.
Right.
So yeah, I mean, Dr. Steele, or I think it's Dr. is, I mean, the book is called Whistling Vivaldi.
Yes.
And it's just,
great book.
I mean,
Yes.
I love that guy. Brilliant work.
Yeah, I mean, and the other thing about Dr. Steele that I've gleaned from is the idea that the brain is not hardwired. So that's something else that he's promoted. That and you spoke to it earlier about, you know, whether we are born a certain way or the cognition that we have when we take a test, or that when we approach a test is hardwired. But in fact, we can learn, you know, and that, you know, the brain is malleable.
Totally. Yeah. Neuroplasticity, I guess, is the term that they use for it. Yeah. Because people, you know, is it nature, nurture, nature, nurture? And, you know, it's the interplay. I mean, you have a genetic code, I have a genetic code, but then there's a question of what genes get turned on or get turned off, right? So one of the things we know, and there are a couple things in there that are really fun. One, to your point about training, if we go back to that same with the worriers and warriors, even the worriers can be trained to develop stress tolerance. So even under high pressure, they can feel a sense of control and handle this well. Yeah. And it's simply that what happens for a lot of kids is they don't practice with any pressure. They kind of go from tryouts to the championship game. Right. And what we want to do, if you know that you're wired that way, it's kind of exposure therapy. You just do it more and more, and you take 1,000 shots of the basket, right? You know, you take more practice tests and you develop that stress tolerance. Right. Curious point, that COMT gene is the same one that's involved in the placebo effect.
Oh.
So in both of our books, in the Self-Driven Child and What Do You Say, we lean into how important from a stress perspective a sense of control is, right? And more so for different people. And so chances are, if you're a kid who's a little bit more antsy and anxious about tests, feeling that sense of control is even more important for you. One of the challenges, of course, with standardized tests is there are people who have, and Paul Tuff talks beautifully about this in his book, what is it called now? The Inequality Machine is the paperback version about the process of applying to college. That part of the deal is people who have the opportunity to work with someone like me can develop a greater sense of control because they do more practice, they understand, they get insights, you know, and they just don't kind of walk in there cold the way I did in high school. Now, you may have had the same thing, right? Fortunately, as I talked about Mr. Tractor Guy, right? I dealt well with pressure, with the stress that I felt on that. And to me, it was exciting. But there's a really darn good chance that there are people on the other side of the room or the other side of the country who are everybody's bright as I think I am, or more so. But their brains were wired differently and they didn't have the opportunity to do any practice. And then they got scores that thought, well, maybe I'm just not that, when of course they are. They just didn't know how to feel more, how to lower their stress by doing the things that increase their sense of control, so that their true smarts, for lack of a better word, would come through on the test.
Yeah. Well, that the idea of stress changing one's mental state, so that different aspects of their personality or cognitive ability arise or are suppressed plays into perhaps what you were saying about math. So this is it's a good
Yes.
connection to that. So one of the things you pointed to was the necessity for logical thinking, and that regardless of how questions are posed in the math section, that really what's being tested is your logical ability and not so much, as you mentioned before, sort of advanced, algebraic thinking per se.
Yeah, I mean, the way that I think, the one way that I think about math is, and I'll say this about standardized tests generally, you can't do well, you won't do well in this test. People don't do well on them without having skills and having knowledge, right? You can't go in there and just guess your way to a test. I mean, people who say this is nothing but tricks, I see it pretty differently, right?
Okay.
If you don't know, with 2x times 2x, is that 2x squared? Is that 4x? If you don't have those tools. The challenge is you can have those skills, have that knowledge, have been a good student in school, and then not do as well on the test. And the math, what the test makers would say is that it's about knowing what tool to use and when. And I certainly see a lot of students who, this is a little ungenerous, but I describe them as station to station in that they allegedly master the material for chapter 7, take a test on chapter 7, throw it over their shoulders, forget that as they move on to chapter 8. And where some, this is not true, this is not of all math teachers, but certainly some students I see where they do a lot of questions for practice, for homework, for a quiz, and then the test looks exactly like what they've done before. And so they've kind of internalized the content there, but not really what it actually means, right? So in Paul Tubbs' book, he talks about a guy named Yuri Treithman, who's a professor at calculus, right?
Yes.
Oh my gosh, I mean, brilliant. And he said, you think, even though you got a 5 in the AP, you don't really know what to use and when. And so, when they're better, one thing I like about, and this is double-edged sword, that standardized tests are in some ways asking kids to apply stuff that they kind of know in novel or creative ways, which is kind of cool. And I like that part about them. But there's also a question of what are we testing then? Are we actually testing, and so again, folks, if it's too twisty or too not like what they've done in school, it's not really demonstrating that Ned doesn't know this math. It's simply demonstrating, all we know is I got that question wrong. And again, we don't know, did I miss it because I didn't know the knowledge? Did I miss it because I didn't know what tool to use or how to apply? Did I miss it because I forgot to divide by 2 at the end? Did I miss it because I didn't bubble in the right answer because in the work that I do, I really think of my job is trying to diagnose underperformance. That's pretty much it, right?
Okay.
And then help try to figure out where are you going wrong. So like this one of the most simple things in the world, because students bring to standardized tests their experience from things in school. One thing we know about school is if you don't finish the questions, bad things happen, right?
Right. Yeah. Right.
And so with standardized tests, though, there's no partial credit, right? You do not want to do 100% of the questions and be 90% right on all of them. That can get you a 0, right?
Right.
But for kids, if I said, look, Arnold, the way for you to do the best is we're going to focus on 80% and just crush it, and you'll get a score that's 90th percentile, and that would be awesome. You will hear, if I'm not very careful, you will hear, Ned doesn't think I can do this math, right? Or you'll go to the test, and because under pressure we go to our default, you're likely to speed up because in your experience, if you left 20% of the questions blank, at best you have an 80, and more likely you have a C, and you're not a C student. You don't do C's, right? And so kids stress, and so it goes back to that practice and experience. So, I mean, standardized. My biggest concern about standardized tests is that, again, this idea that that it's the same experience for every person, and that it's saying the same thing about different people. I mean, I really thought that College Board was on to something with their environmental context dashboard. If you remember that, you know, basically, what's the experience in your school, right? What's in your neighborhood? Because all of these things, just like ACE scores matter, right? We can predict who's likely to have more problems with you know, heart health based on how much stress they had as a kid. We can also predict, you know, that a 1200, you know, from this kid, knowing that they didn't have the advantage of the school on the other side of town, that's actually a really good achievement. And that actually tells us, you know, this kid may not know everything yet, but man, there's a good engine under the hood there, kind of thing.
Yeah. So what's interesting about that is that what that said to me is they finally came around to an idea that Dr. Carnevale had promoted, what, 15 years ago with that concept strivers. So that is exactly what he was saying. He was saying that colleges should pay attention to the conditions under which students are learning and take that into account when thinking about their performance on standardized tests. So but back then when he said it, people didn't want to hear it. But you know, that's what happens when you're a leader, you know, in that space, and you know, you're thinking ahead. When you put your ideas out there, people won't necessarily accept them, you know, when you do that. So
well, and it's interesting because, gosh, there was, I was listening to a conversation yesterday. It was a professor at Georgetown University. I can't remember. Anyway, talking about, you know, we have this idea, we have this mythology about a level playing field. Right. And so to say, wait a second, that kid got a 1200 and my kid got a 14, you're going to say he gets in and my kid doesn't? That's not the American way. That's not fair, right? But it's based on the assumption that everyone has a level playing field, that everyone's got the same opportunity. Or, oh my gosh, is it, there's a wonderful body of research under the heading of Headwinds, Tailwinds. It's Tom Gilovich and Shai Davidai, I think that's how I pronounce the name, Israeli, that basically makes the point that as humans, we're not very aware of our tailwinds, of all the ways that have supported us, right? But we're very mindful of our headwinds. And so we just have such a hard time looking and realizing that this other person, that I have these advantages that everyone else didn't have, right? Because they just, what was that thing that just came out of Penn at Wharton when they asked students at Wharton, like, what the average salary was for people in America? And they were off by, like, you know, they said it's like 190,000 or something like that. When it's really like, you know, I mean, they were up by like $150,000. I mean, just wildly off. Because if I grew up in this environment when everybody is like me, I just can't have, it's so hard for me to do the cognitive work of thinking that other people might be elsewhere. And then when I do, to really admit that I've had all of these advantages, it you know, it devalues what I think of as my sort of natural achievement. And it made me be mindful of how unfair the world is. And that's a little bit too painful in some ways, because what am I going to do about it? And so we just choose to believe what we wish to be true. We choose to believe that it's completely fair. And from my perspective, we're never going to make the world completely fair. But we should move in that direction. And we should admit that it's not fair when it's not. You know, I'll take a shot at College Board and the Khan Academy, and I love the Khan Academy. I think they do great work, but I'm still annoyed because when the two of them came out, Sal Khan and David Coleman, they had a conversation, a video chat, and they talked about. What was the line they used? This collaboration between College Board and Khan Academy, it is not the world's best free online test prep. It's not the world's best free online test prep. It's the world's best test prep online, free. Boy, that sounds clever. Kudos to the marketing folks. But it's not true. It's just not, it's not true. Because if preparation for anything were only about knowledge, why would we need teachers? Why would we need coaches? It would make no difference if you sat there and watched 10 hours of video, or if you spent 10 hours with someone like me who can, let me ask you a question here and guide your thinking and point things out to you. In Paul's book, he he looked at all this analysis of Khan Academy and College Board, and College Board was so upset they put out a press release refuting what he had said.
Wow.
But there's a student in the book, a kid named Ben Dormis, who's just an incredible human being. He's sophomore, junior now, just incredible. His family, so his parents are under resourced relative to DC. I mean, they run a school for kind of emotionally troubled kids. So they're like literally doing the Lord's work. And someone, a parent here at an independent school, just fell in love with this kid, and hooked him up with an independent college counselor, and footed the bill for that, or she did a pro bono, I don't know. And then they reached out to me, say, hey, can you work with this kid? I'm like, sure, happy to, And he had spent all of his junior year doing Khan Academy stuff, because those are the resources available to him. And his math score went from a 570 on his PSAT to a 530 on the SAT after all this work. Oh, that's unexpected, right?
Right.
So he rolls in with me. We spend the summer together, and he goes off and gets a 670 or 680 or whatever, which along with a 790 or something he already had to read. He was brilliant linguistically, but as we talked about before, his stress is much more likely to affect math than it does reading, and he was already a total rock star in reading. And some of, I gave him, tricks as Paul would describe, so that he felt, I've got a sword, I don't have to jump through your hoop. He felt more a sense of control. But I also talked about all the stuff we talked about, Dr. Steele and all this stuff. So what, I like to think that I gave him useful tools, but I'd like to think that also some of it was just, you have a conversation, when you remember the teachers, the professors who were influential on you, it probably wasn't the stuff, it was that connection.
Right.
And so this is one of the things, we're doing as much work as we can to share, what we think we know, and to help every kid, whether they've got, high resources or low resources. But I think Carnevale and Dr. Collin was so on point, because it makes a huge difference what your experience has been for the first 8, 10, 12, 16 years of your life. And to act like it doesn't is like, well, wait a second. Well, then why are these people choosing this neighborhood? The houses are so much more expensive for the schools. Why are you sending your kid to a private school? They have better food there. Give me a break, right? You foot that bill for the education, and for us in America or anywhere in the world to say that it's a completely level playing field is just rubbish. And the dishonesty just makes me crazy.
Well, this is great. What I want to do is kind of try to distill our conversation down to a point where we could think about what specifically you would say to parents. I mean, you have PrepMatters. I know you have a chance to really engage parents and families, in more depth, on an individual basis. But for those who are just listening now and want to get a sort of a general sense, what are some of the things that some of the good traits that you would say parents should exhibit, or the students should exhibit
for standardized tests specifically?
Yes.
Okay, so I'll just rattle a bunch of things off. The first thing, starting at the earliest possible age, there is no, and this is important for me, the things that I'm talking about that are useful, in my view, that are useful for standardized tests are useful for all of their learning. So the first thing would be, I would do everything we can to make it easier, make it a family value, a habit to read as much as we can. To read as much as we can. There's wonderful research. It's Hart and Risley. They were two professors at the University of Kansas who were tasked with kind of understanding what's going well, what's not going well with the Head Start program. This was probably a couple decades ago. And they looked at kind of lower income, middle income, and upper income, and looked at the differences. And one of the differences was, like by age 4, it was like a 5 million word gap between them. And so basically put, probably just because of demands on work and home life, folks who had more resources were just able to spend more time with their kids and literally just talking with them more. With them more. So I don't know how old the kids are. So if you're starting little guys like 3, 4, 5, do everything you can to delay digital stuff. Every time I see a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old with an iPad, I just want to go over and just scream at the parent. You don't know what you're doing,
Mhm.
because we're wiring kids' brains to attend to screens rather than to books. So making it a habit, for as parents, and we don't have to force books on kids. Whatever they're interested in reading is good. It can
Mhm.
be comic books, it can be graphic novels, it can be stuff that's not that sophisticated, right? And that's fine. We
Mhm.
want that interest, that interest, that interest. So reading for me would be the big thing.
Mhm.
When you get into school age, or particularly towards middle school, we really want to have the focus in math to be on learning things and learning it well. Again, not that kind of station to station, but where you're really thinking about it. I would,
What does that mean? Like when you say
well,
station to station?
so what I mean is that a lot of kids, they think the only purpose of math
Mhm.
in school generally, and it's not their fault, because it's the incentive system, the reward system. Did you get an A? Did you get an A? Did you get an A? Did you get an A?
Mhm.
As opposed to, I mean, the Khan Academy, to its great credit, talks about, we want to develop mastery, right? We really want to understand why this works, right? And
Mhm.
math taught well and engaged fully is fascinating,
Mhm.
but not if you feel stressed the whole time.
Okay.
So, a couple things on math. One, I really caution people not to push their kids to always be in the most advanced math, the most advanced math, the most advanced
Okay.
math. Okay.
Interesting. Okay.
I encourage them to explore it,
Mhm.
but the ideal learning environment, and this is true in anything, this can be sports, this can be math, anything. The ideal learning environment is one where kids are challenged, but they don't feel threatened.
Okay.
Because if you're not challenged, you're not going to engage. You're looking out the window. And we
Right.
don't grow without being stretched a little bit.
Mhm.
But if we feel threatened the whole time, like I'm the only one who doesn't get this, I have the lowest, maybe I don't belong in here.
Mm.
We kind of have a problem, because again, your brain is filling with your cortisol flooding, stress hormones going nuts, and you're not going to be able to attend and learn things well in school.
Mm.
Now, as well as you could. So with math, you want to try to, I mean, from my perspective, take interest in it. And when you're working with kids, you want to try to ask questions and do as little as you can to actually teach them. I mean, you do when you need to. In our book, The Self-Driven Child, we talk about there's a chapter in the book called "I Love You Too Much to Fight with You About Your Homework."
Okay.
And because a lot of parents feel like it's their job
Mhm.
to get their kids to do the homework, to get their kids to perform at a certain level. And the problem with that is that over time, kids can oftentimes start resisting what's in their own best interest, because a
Right.
low sense of control is really stressful.
Right.
And two, kids can develop the sense that someone other than themselves is responsible for their success, that they're
Mm.
not the experts on themselves. So
Okay.
we talk about being a consultant. You want to offer help, you want to offer advice. You don't step away and say, it's your life, pal, good luck, right?
Right.
But we just want to get out of the business of trying to push kids, because they oftentimes do need our help, but we don't want them to resist our help or to think that their success is because of someone other than themselves.
Okay.
When you get to standardized tests, you want, again, just be curious about this, right? A lot of people, oh my gosh, you did that. How did you do that badly? Oh my gosh. That is not a question. That
Yeah.
is not a question. That's an accusation with a question mark at the end. I mean, give me a break, right? And
Mhm.
so, I mean, because I work, so much of my focus is on anxiety. When kids come in, even with like some of the lowest scores that you can imagine people getting, I
Right.
will tend to flip through and go, huh, okay, right. Well, my hunch is there are a few of these you probably missed. There's some stuff that you probably need to learn, but I suspect that some of these, I think there's some things that you missed that you actually already know how to do. But I don't see anything here that worries me.
Okay.
I'm guessing from the look on your face, you're not so happy with the score, and I get that. So let's aim for something hard. But I don't see anything here that worries me. And because
Interesting.
I've done this for 8 million years, right, it carries a certain amount of credibility. Um, so with standardized tests, we want to give kids every option to work as hard as they want to. But when we push them, we have a problem. I will tell you, I have a client who, oh, I like them, but oh, the most tightly wound mom in the world.
Okay.
The morning that the girl is taking the ACT, I get this text from her like, I don't think she did any work at all. I've been flipping through her workbook and she could resell this like barely used. And I'm just like,
Uh-huh. Right.
I've only been doing this for 30 years, right?
Okay.
And I texted her back. I said, well, to let you know, here's where we did a lot of other work, and I'm pretty confident in her ability, and I'm proud of the hard work that she did. Out of curiosity, if she kept a diary, would you have flipped through that?
Mm.
And she would text back, I'd like to say I wouldn't, but I'm not really sure.
Okay.
Right? And
Right.
so with school, with standardized tests,
Yeah.
we want kids to work hard.
Mm-hmm.
But more fundamentally, we want them to want to work hard.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
And so the model for this, what's called intrinsic motivation. So the kid feels that they're in charge of their life rather than someone else is trying to force them.
Yes.
We need to feel a sense of competency. We need a sense of relatedness, and we need a sense of autonomy. So
Okay.
too often as parents, we focus on the skills, the competency,
Mm-hmm.
but we move into being a micromanager, which undermines our relationship with them.
Mm-hmm.
And it obviously whacks kids' autonomy.
Right.
And so this is where we talk about, you just try to be a consultant. So kiddo, I'll help you any way that I can. If you want me to play proctor, I'll play proctor. If you want me to do the math as well and see how badly I do, and then we can compare notes, and you just offer help because
Okay.
it's respectful and it makes it much more likely that kids engage. And the last sort of point on this with this practice is many people know the 10,000 hour rule, right? Anders
Right.
Ericsson was in the Gladwell book. The thing that gets lost in that is it wasn't 10,000 hours of practice. It was 10,000 hours of deliberate practice,
Yes.
meaning I
Yes.
really pay attention. Well, that didn't work. Why didn't that work?
Mm-hmm.
And when kids, if kids are being flogged, they're going to do it just to get me off their back, which is not the same thing as really deeply engaging with it.
Okay.
Last two things about standardized tests. First of all, is that almost every school in the country is test score optional. Test score
Yes.
optional. So I know I'm talking myself out of a job. Fantastic. But knowing that actually makes it easier for kids who might be reluctant to work hard because the major manifestation of anxiety is avoidance. So people avoid the things that make them stressed. So when I work with wildly stressed out kids, the first thing we pull up FAIR test, right? Look at all these. You don't have to take this. You don't have to take this.
Right.
Because most mental health is changing thinking from I have to, which doesn't do good things, particularly if you're a worrier, changing that to I want to. And so you may want to because your dad took it and you love to beat his score, right? This school would become, I'd like to see how well I can do.
Right.
And it changes that energy, right? Much like with Dr. Steele. I really want to do well on this, but not I have to. And because if I don't, some terrible things will happen. And for parents, they should certainly spend some time. I would certainly spend some time at FAIR Test. They have great stuff on there. I have if you're interested, I can share this with you. A piece that I wrote for U.S. News and World Report of all things about taming test anxiety. And I guess the last thing is simply that to remind ourselves that what's stressful to you and what's stressful to me, what's exciting to you and what's exciting to me can be very different things. There's a performance curve, a bell curve called the Yerkes-Dodson curve. And it measures physiological arousal. They measure this in salivary cortisol, so stress hormones in your spit, and then performance going up and down on the y-axis. And the idea is this: if there's no stress, typically there's no performance. We need a little bit of excitement, a little bit of energy to engage, right? Somewhere in the middle, there's optimal arousal where you're excited, but you don't feel overwhelmed. But then as the stress gets higher, performance starts to fall apart.
Right.
And the important thing is your curve and my curve aren't the same thing. I have no idea. You may think this is awesome. And I'm like, oh, dude, seriously, no. Right. And it may be different for you on one activity than for me on another. Right. I'm super high tolerance with tractors, maybe not with something else. And so for parents, so often we think, oh my gosh, dude, it's not that big a deal for you.
Yeah.
For you.
Right.
And so we want it. This is where we put our kids in the driver's seat and we play consultant, and we want to push them as much as they want to be pushed. Right. Not our level of it.
Okay. Awesome. All right, Ned, this is my last question. This is
okay.
Good. I really appreciate it. So this is kind of flips the questions on its head. So if you have to take a moment, that's fine.
Sure.
But I want you to imagine the possibility that you could go back in time and anonymously talk to your parents, your mom, your dad, whoever raised you, guardian, whoever raised you, and knowing how you wound up, you're going to bring back with you knowledge of how you wound up, and you're going to counsel your parents or whoever raised you on what you would have liked for them to say. So it could be that everything was great, but if there was something that you would have them say, what age would you go to, and what would you have them say?
Yeah. So this may be a little bit of a curveball for you. So I had a really interesting childhood. In some ways, my parents were terrific folks. I mean, they worked hard. They were both very smart. So I'm thankful for what little genetic gifts I got from them. They were very decent people. On the other hand, my father's an alcoholic who eventually drank himself to death. And my mother struggled with mental health for a long time, in and out of institutions. When their marriage fell apart in ways that would have been a spectacularly interesting movie, I spent about 3 months of 7th grade in a pediatric psychiatric hospital. So my childhood was in some ways great, and in some ways really not easy. If I could wish anything for them, I mean, my dad is obviously passed at this point, but if I could wish anything for them, it would simply be that if they had been able to do more work on themselves and being happier and being healthier, it would have helped me enormously. Because like pretty much every kid who's ever been divorced, whose parents were divorced, I spent years of my life doing shuttle diplomacy. And probably it's made me, I mean, in hindsight, it's probably made me really good at reading complicated feelings that sort of play out across people's faces, because I spent so long watching those faces and trying to figure out how do I, I was curious. I have a book called What Do You Say? Trying to figure out how exactly do I say this so I can make this a little bit better. And of course, it really was a fool's errand, because they who were who they were, and their relationship was their relationship. I really wasn't going to probably make a big difference. But this is true for I think a lot of parents, where it doesn't often occur to them that for them to be happier is an enormous gift to their children. There's a big survey, I think it was in the UK, where the biggest thing that the teenagers wanted of or from their parents is simply for them to be happier. Because while parents think that they spend all of their time looking at their kids and how do I make this better, and keep my kids on an even keel, children are doing the same thing. They don't want their parents to be unhappy. I know you think all they do is play video games. Of course they want me to be unhappy. But children are all the time watching. It's deeply stressful to children if their parents are angry, or if they're afraid, or if they're wildly upset all the time. And so I wish that my parents had been more even keeled, more equanimous, I suppose, when things didn't go well. Their hashtag SAT words. That would have been easier for me. There's an acronym. There's a wonderful researcher named Sonia Lupian who talks about what makes us nuts, and summarized with the acronym NUTS. And so N is novelty. Hey, the novel coronavirus, right? Unpredictability. T is perceived threat, and S is a low sense of control. And so as a kid with the parents who, mental health and substance use disorder, the unpredictability was enormous. I got thrown out of my house all the time, and I swear to you, I was the most nerdy kid you could ever meet. And the sense of control was really, really, really low. And it's taken me decades of my life really to pull that stress out of my nervous system. So that would be my thing for parents, and it just doesn't often occur to them, particularly if things aren't going well, that they can actually help their kids by being happier themselves.
Wow. I did not expect that. Thank you so much for sharing that.
Curveball.
No, I that makes it real. That makes it real, because, the way that I go about these conversations is it could be sort of esoteric, because we're talking about
a little
academic
cerebral
achievement. Right. But we're talking about real relationships. We're talking about the real things that we as families encounter, the difficulties that we all encounter. you know, for you to be able to share that, with us, I'm very grateful for you, because
No,
I
well,
know
you're
that
welcome.
touched families that were watching. So
Yeah, and it's so I mean, and I say this, I mean, because people are watching this right now with, during COVID still raging, right? And
right,
all sorts of other ways that the world's on fire.
yeah,
Um, and in the second book we have called What Do You Say? We started out talking with a bunch of kids and teens and adults. And there's one conversation I remember sitting in my office in town. There's a bunch of kids who walked over from Wilson High School. And one of the questions we asked them is, who do you feel closest to in the world?
mm,
And sometimes it was mom, dad, sometimes my grandma, my coach, my cousin, whatever. So what about them makes you feel close to them?
mm,
And they said, well, two things. One, we got, they listen to me without judging me.
mm-hmm,
And they don't tell me what to do all the time.
mm,
And this is important because it turns out that if there is a single thing that's the closest thing to a silver bullet against the effects on stress particularly on developing brains, it's the close connection of a child with some caring adult, ideally a consistent caregiver. That's as close as you get.
mm,
And so for me, I found that in some other ways. But right now, when our kids are, particularly if you have kids who were doing great in school and now they're pancaking, and it's so stressful to us as parents,
yeah,
because our fears, they're not really about the present, they're about the future. You imagine that this life you imagine for your kid is going up in smoke with every bad grade. And then we get more anxious, and then we get more controlling, and then we try to
yes,
execute the grades or get the higher scores or check their diary like
right.
the worst
It's true.
parent, right?
It's true.
Right. And what that does is it undermines our relatedness, it
Yeah.
undermines the autonomy and the kid's sense of competency that's necessary for them to be intrinsically motivated. But most importantly, it undermines our connection with them. And it doesn't occur to parents, it's not obvious that if you got a kid who's struggling, that one of the most helpful things you can do is don't worry about the bad grades or whatever, but put all of your energy into the relationship with that kid. And in that, one of the most powerful things you can say to a kid is, I love you no matter what. And
Mm,
not just I love you no matter how well you do in school. I love you. And I don't care, no matter how hard you work or don't work. There's nothing you can do, because so many parents say, well, as long as they work their hardest, I don't care. That's still conditional
right.
love.
Right.
And
Right.
it's hard because we want our kids to work hard, but it doesn't occur that, again, wanting them to work hard,
Yeah.
competency, relatedness,
Yes.
and autonomy. So if we put our energy into the relationship, trust me,
Mm,
if you focus on your relationship with your kid, not their schoolwork,
yeah.
and the relationship gets better,
Mm,
the schoolwork will too.
wow. That is a perfect place for us to to put a bow on this fabulous conversation. Ned, it's been great. I again appreciate all of your insight, and I think that there's a lot here for parents to glean from.
Yeah, I mean, the stuff that I spend a lot of time talking with, helping kids prepare for standardized tests, but it really is all this, a lot of these other things we've talked about. I'm so grateful to have this conversation with you, Arnold,
Yeah.
they really support performance on tests in school, but also just with healthy lives. So I try to spend my time where I can, not talking about the SAT and ACT and other four-letter words, but all these other things that matter, like our relationships with our kids and developing healthy brains.
Excellent. All right. Well, my best to you and your family.
Thank you.
Hope, everything turns out, things that we discussed earlier, that it turns
Yeah.
out great. And
Yeah.
I'll be in touch.
Super.
But yeah, it was great to talk to you again. And
Likewise.
All right.
Give my best to your voice, okay?
All right. Thank you. I will. All right. Take
Thanks.
care. All right.
Bye-bye.
Wow. I so appreciate Ned being so transparent and sharing his testimony. When we have these kinds of conversations about academic achievement, yes, they can be lofty and philosophical, but he kept it real. And he also focused on practical steps. The idea of focusing on reading and getting our children early exposure to words that, could turn out to be vocabulary words on the SAT. Also thinking about early exposure to the kinds of questions that could be asked on the SAT and having a better mindset about how to approach them. And then also thinking about family relationships. All of those things are important, and I'm really glad that he shared them. I had a hard time trying to cut stuff off from it, but you made it to the end with me. So I hope you'll subscribe and come back. There'll be more to share. I have more people to interview. But until that time you do, thank you so much and take care.